So for this video, I'm going to be going over my June wrap-up. All of the books that I managed to read in the month of June, all of the books that I read for the Olympics Readathon. And I want to give a quick shout out to Team Poseidon for coming in first place, for winning the Olympics Readathon, and more importantly, for taking down Alan and Team Zeus, because that was the more important task. And I want to give a quick shout out to everyone who was on Team Apollo. We did a pretty good job. We were at the number 3 spot at one point. We kind of tampered down just a little bit, but we still finished in 7th place out of like 16 teams. So we did pretty good. I think for the last couple of weeks, some of us may have experienced a little bit of burnout. I know I did. I was trying to read a bunch of longer books to try to get more points, but I quickly got burnt out and I took a little bit of breaks here and there. So I probably could have read more, but like I said, I just got very tired, and I still managed to read a good amount of books, and these are the books that I read in the month of June. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. I think instead of talking about these books from my least favorite to my favorite, I'm going to be talking about them in the order that I read them for the Readathon. And the first book that I completed for the Readathon was for the Apollo prompt, which was to read a sort of non-traditional or mixed media format. And for this one, I chose a comic book, and that would be Meathouse Man by George R.R. Martin. This was a short story that George wrote back in the 80s that he had turned into a comic book, and I very much enjoyed it. It's one of my favorite short stories of his. And to see it turn into a comic book was very disturbing because it's got a really nasty premise to it, but it was fun. I don't really read comic books. I've never really been into comic books, but jumping into this one, it was a good time. It's about these people who are called corpse handlers, and they're able to mentally handle these corpses into doing tasks that not everyone wants to do. And the more capable you are of handling a greater number of corpses at the same time, the more value you have. And it gets a little weird because there's some other things that they do. I don't want to get into it. And I would show you pictures, but honestly, there's not really a lot of pictures that I can show you in this comic book. So if you're interested in reading a very dark, very creepy, very disturbing story, check this one out. The next book I read was for the Aphrodite prompt, which is to read a book with a beautiful cover, and that gave me a great excuse to read this book, which would be The Push. The author, Ashley Aldrain, managed to do something that not a lot of authors can easily do. She very much disturbed me and made me feel very uncomfortable and made me have feelings of deep dread. Not a lot of authors can, evoke that emotion out of me. And I'm weirdly glad she did. I don't know what that says about me, but I pretty much loved this book. I gave it 4.5 stars. It's basically just this mom, and she's kind of having a rough life, and something happens around the midway point of this book that completely turns her life upside down, and it was not great. And, well, what happens to her is not great. The book was great, but like I said, it was very disturbing, and there were a couple of lines in here that, like I've said, were just a gut punch to my soul, and I read them and I was just like, oh, man. It's one of those books that is fantastic upon the first time you read it, but it's not a book that I would necessarily want to read again anytime soon. Maybe in the distant future once I've kind of blocked it out of my mind, and then I get to relive my trauma once again. But yeah, it was a fantastic book. 4.5 stars. And after reading that very dark and depressing book, I wanted kind of a pick-me-up book. A book that normally I probably wouldn't reach for very often, but in this case, I needed something a lot more lighter. And so I picked up, what's this book called? Arsenic and Adobo by Mia P. Manansala. You can see how much I prepared for this video. I think initially I picked this for the fire prompt, but, you know, I could have easily picked it for the food prompt, because obviously this is a damn book. It's a murder mystery about someone owning a restaurant and working at a restaurant, and there's food on the cover. Duh! All that to say that I wasn't a huge fan of this book. I think I gave it like a very generous 3 stars. It's probably more like a 2.5-star read. The characters weren't great, and the premise was pretty cool. It's about this Filipino family who own this restaurant, and one of the younger cousins works, you know, at the restaurant, and she, you know, is trying out different recipes, and in comes her ex-boyfriend who, you know, everyone kind of hates, and she gives him kind of like this new recipe she's been working on, and wouldn't you know it, he dies. And the police kind of suspect her of drugging him and poisoning him and killing him. And that's a very cool and interesting premise. And it sounded like a really fun read, because, like, how the hell is she going to get out of that? But sadly enough, the execution just wasn't there. The characters weren't there. It was pretty predictable, and I think this is one of the very first cozy mysteries besides, like, Agatha Christie that I've ever read, and honestly, I'm just not a huge fan. And this book definitely, like, picked me up a little bit, because there were some funny moments there, and I needed something to pick me up after the devastating push. But overall, this just wasn't that great, and I think retroactively I'm going to give it 2.5 stars. And while I was making my way through those shorter books, I was also reading a longer book along with those, and that would be 12 Kings in Sherikai. And I used this for the Zeus prompt, which is basically just read a book with a patriarchy, and it's called 12 Kings. So bingo! This was a reread for me, one of my all-time favorite fantasy books. It's about this girl named Cheda who wants to get revenge on these kings for something that happened to her in her past. And it's very good, very gripping, and like I said, one of my all-time favorite fantasy books. And while I'm busy talking about that, I might as well talk about the sequel, because I also read the sequel, and this was also a reread for me. I gave both of these books 5 stars, and I'm very eager to continue with the series, because I read both of these books years ago, and I never continued, but I plan on trying to finish this series, or at least most of the 6-book series, this year. I think I still enjoy the first book slightly more than the second book. I think this book is a little bit better paced. It's a little bit more smoothly paced. While this book, it has terrific scenes, like probably some scenes that are better than what's in this book, but it feels a little bit disjointed. But either way, they're both 5-star books. Terrific start to a terrific series. I also read a book by an author who's quickly becoming one of my all-time favorite fantasy authors, and that would be Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I had previously read Daisy Jones and the Six, which is a top 10 book for me all time, and The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, which is another 5-star book for me. So when I found out that this was a Book of the Month Club pick, I quickly decided that's what I wanted to pick, and I read it, and I absolutely loved it. Gave it 5 stars. I don't quite like it as much as Daisy Jones, but I do like it slightly more than Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. This book is about 4 siblings who are all kind of rich and famous now, and part 1 kind of goes back to their childhood, and it goes through kind of their rough patch in life as children and what they had to go through, and it gets pretty dark, a lot more darker than I was expecting. And then part 2 is basically like this huge party that they're throwing at their mansion, and someone kind of shows up to kind of, spoil it all. And I thought this book was tremendous, and I thought it was very fun, but also tackles some very gripping and very important themes. It has characters you love, and then it has characters that you love to hate, and it has a very cathartic ending, and I love cathartic endings. It gave me exactly what I wanted to have happen. For a moment, I was expecting the author to go a different way, and I was like, no, don't do that. I will hate this book if you do that. But she didn't, of course, and it was perfect. So yeah, easy 5 stars. And then my next book, I sadly DNF'd, which is sad because obviously you want to get points for the readathon, right? So I wanted to try to push through this book, but I was just really not enjoying it at all, and that would be The Queen of Blood by Sarah Beth Durst. This book had me initially intrigued because it has a forest setting, and all of the setting takes place in like these treetops, and that sounded really cool. And then on top of that, there's kind of like these ghostly spirits that are like attacking people because they want to like save and preserve the forest. And I thought that was a pretty cool premise. And the opening chapter was very cool, and like it basically showed all of what I wanted to have happen. But then quickly after that, it turned into one of my least favorite fantasy tropes, and it had this young girl go to a school setting. And I'm really not a fan of school settings in fantasy, or just in general. Like, I've already been to school. I don't want to have to relive that shit. And the character work, from what little I read, wasn't that compelling, and I really just wasn't digging this book. And I DNF'd it fairly quickly around like page 60. I got a few chapters in, and I was just like, this is not holding my attention. I don't give a crap what's happening. So I DNF'd it. I may keep it, just, it could have been a mood thing, but I really don't see myself ever liking this book, so I might just unhaul it. I'm not sure, but sadly enough, Queen of Blood just wasn't for me. My next 2 books I pretty much read back to back, and they're the last 2 books in one of my all-time fantasy series, and I wasn't exactly planning on reading the very last book until July, but the book 5 ended on such a cliffhanger that I was like, what the hell? I can't not read the next book. So, of course, I'm talking about Age of Death, Book 5 in The Legends of the First Empire by Michael J. Sullivan, and Book 6, Age of Empire. And both of these books were fantastic. I think I gave this book maybe like 4 stars, and then I gave this book 4.5 stars. Terrific ending to the series. One of my all-time favorite fantasy series. And of course, it's books 5 and 6. I can't really talk about what happens in this book. And pretty much it's one of my favorite fantasy series because it's really hard to predict what the hell is going to happen from book to book to book. It's very unconventional in that manner, because you read the first book and you kind of get an idea of what's going to go down, but there's no way you can predict, from after reading the first book, like what goes on in these books. It's night and day, and I love the series for that. This is definitely a fantasy series I can see myself reading again and again for the rest of my life. Terrific. I love Michael J. Sullivan, and I can't wait to start his, other series, because this was sort of his prequel series, and then he has his Royce and Hadrian series. I want to jump into that. I also read The Bone Shard Daughter, which is a fantasy debut. One of the best fantasy debuts I think I've ever read. This was an easy 5 stars for me. One of the best fantasy books I've ever read, and there's a lot of reasons for that. The characters were great, but it was also just extremely unique. I've never quite read a fantasy book like this one. It's all about animal bones and bone shard magic, and using these animal bones to create constructs that the Emperor uses to kind of help him rule his nation. And once I heard that, I was like, I am sold. I am going to read this book. And the character perspectives that we get in here are very intriguing. One of the main characters, you kind of don't know her past, and she doesn't either. She kind of has this amnesia, and she really doesn't remember a whole lot about her past, and she's trying to figure out more about her life and just the kingdom. And there's a very cool mystery aspect to her story. And there's also another character, this dude, who's a smuggler, who kind of jumps from all of these different islands that are a part of this land, and he's doing a bunch of stuff, and how his story kind of interweaves with everything was very cool. And that's another reason why I like this book. The setting was very unique. You have kind of like an archipelago of islands, and I wish fantasy would do that more, because that's a pretty neat way to have like culture clashes, right? Like each island can kind of have its own set of rules and customs and culture, right? Whereas a lot of fantasy just has this like big land, and I think that's a pretty neat way to, construct your fantasy setting, like have an archipelago of islands. I really like that. So yes, one of the best fantasy books I've ever read. The Bone Shard Daughter gets 5 stars. And the last book that I managed to finish in the month of June for the Olympics Readathon is a reread for me, probably my 3rd favorite fantasy book of all time, and that would be The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. Just behind A Storm of Swords and The Way of Kings, this is my 3rd favorite fantasy book ever. I love this series, and I'm going to be rereading the series this year. And I've read this book, and then I'm going to read books 2 and 3 somewhere in the near future. This book is all about Locke Lamora and his gang of thieves, the Gentleman Bastards, trying to pull off this heist and trying to get away with stealing a lot of money. And it's brilliantly told, and it's told in a non-linear format, which I love when stories do that. One of my favorite directors is Tarantino, and he does that a lot. Scott Lynch kind of does a similar thing, and I love it very much. I love the non-linear way it's told. I love the setting and all the cool little details we get sprinkled out through the story. I, of course, love the characters, and the friendship between Locke and John is to die for. And I think it's one of the funniest books I've ever read. It may not come across just the page when you're reading it to yourself, but listening to Michael Page narrate it, the humor comes across brilliantly. And for anyone who hasn't read this book, I highly recommend the audiobook. The audiobook is extremely well done by Michael Page. And of course, this is one of my all-time favorite fantasy books, so I gave it 5 stars. I think I started off saying what prompts those books were for, but then I stopped and I completely forgot about it. Hopefully I remember to edit that in. If not, oh well. Anyway, those are all of the books that I read in the month of June. Please let me know if you guys have read any of these books and what you thought of them. Did you love them? Did you hate them? Were you kind of mad about them? Are you excited to pick up any of these books that I talked about? And if not, whatever. Also, let me know what your favorite and least favorite books that you read in June were. Please let me know down in the comments below. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.